received many questions both in the first week and also this week about how we can advance on the measurement of African development, not necessarily across countries, but also how can we measure development in the same country, let's say in the north or the south of big countries, or across provinces, administrative regions. So it is with great pleasure to introduce this special session that was organized mostly to accommodate the growing demand to discuss those issues. And we're very honored and privileged to have two guests today. Let me start with Marina Mavungu-Ngoma. Marina is a PhD student in economics and public policy at Tufts University in Boston. She did her undergrad in economics at the Università Protestante Congo. She continued her graduate studies with a diploma in public administration in the very famous ENA, the École Nationale d'Administration in Paris. She also did a master's at Williams College before joining Tufts University for her master's and her PhD in public policy and economics jointly by the economics department and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Our main presenter today will be Tanner Regan. Tanner is a colleague at the London Business School at the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development. Tanner joined 1.5 years ago after completing his doctorate in the Geography Department of the London School of Economics and Political Science. And starting in September, he will be Assistant Professor of Economics at George Washington University. Marina and Tanner, thank you big time for taking the time and being with us today. Let me say that Marina is doing very interesting work on various aspects of development, on the microfinance. Tanner is a core area of specialization is urbanization in Africa, among others, which is a defining feature of the so-called African Growth Miracle. So I urge you to visit their websites and learn from their very exciting research. Now, today, let me abuse, if you like, the organizer's privilege and start giving and dealing with one of the most posed questions in the first 4 sessions. How can we measure African output, African quote-unquote development, with the typically used GDP statistics? Let me share my screen, please. Let me start with a mapping of economic development the way traditionally economists have proxied economic development, with a measure of gross domestic product in per capita terms. In your right panel, you see GDP per capita in so-called PPP terms, purchasing power parity terms, which tries to adjust for the fact that many goods, especially non-tradables, think about a haircut, for example, or purchasing mobile telephony, tend to be relatively cheaper in places with lower levels of income, ceteris paribus. Now, as many of you already pinpointed in our correspondence we had, there are various issues with the GDP statistics. These are issues that are by no means specific to Africa. They apply to other parts of the world. For example, I'm sure that many of our friends who listen to us have checked that not only Nigeria, but also China has done various revisions of their GDP estimates. Actually, I come from a country, Greece, that has revised quite a few times in the recent years its GDP numbers. And there are various more, I would say, technical issues on the measurement of output. Now, to give a concrete example and zooming into Africa, now, the typical source for estimates of GDP come from the so-called Penwell tables. That was a very innovative effort that was done in the 80s in order to try to adjust output for the role of prices that, as I mentioned in the introduction, tend to differ wildly between high income, middle income, and lower income countries. Now here, I'm just plotting average growth rates in selected African countries from the mid-70s till the end of 1999. And what you see here on the top of the slide is the top 10 performance and the bottom 10 performance. And the point I want to stress is that even if one was to use exactly the same source, but use somewhat revised data, this would be the vintage 6.2 rather than 6.1, you get quote unquote something like a super extreme paradox. Equatorial Guinea in the old statistics seems to be one of the worst performance in terms of output growth. In the slightly revised estimates, it seems to be the second best performer after Botswana, where it is consistent across the two vintages as being the highest growth performer in Africa. You can see further here that many countries do not appear in the list. So even if one was to use actually the same data source, slight modifications in actually how prices are compiled, one gets very different picture, which is something that does not necessarily mean that we should dismiss this effort by economists. Perhaps we should do even better. And hopefully statistical agencies and the capacity of African states has been improving in the past decade. So perhaps output statistics are going to be more reliable in the years to come. But clearly there are many issues, as many of you rightly pointed out. So one approach that Tanner Regan will touch upon is to try to combine the output statistics that are being done by the statistical agencies with the help quite often of international organizations with some other data, for example, satellite imagery on light density at night, or with individual survey data, and have two, let's say, mismeasured or inaccurate or not so good proxies of output, combine them together, and through some statistical procedure, try to account for noise. Another approach, which will feature much more prominently in this series as the course and the lectures develop, is to move beyond GDP, because not only we will be able to account for some of the shortcomings of output statistics, but perhaps we will be able to say something meaningful about regional or perhaps sectoral disaggregations, which tend to be at first glance considerable in Africa, as well as other countries, and perhaps say something to say about inequality, which is a very huge topic, not only again in Africa, but also more generally. For example, very recent work by Gabe Zuckman and Emmanuel Saez and co-authors try to do exactly that in the context of the United States, move beyond aggregate GDP series and have so-called distributional national accounts. So by no means what we will discuss today with Tanner and Marina apply only to Africa. Now, looking into Africa in particular, there tends to be this pattern that was observed by Williamson in a very early contribution in the mid-60s, that countries that tend to specialize in agriculture, as for example many African countries, tend to have large disparities across regions in economic performance. In other words, one of the striking results of Williamson, and subsequent work has tended to verify this pattern, is that the lowest the level of development, the higher the inequities, or if you like, the heterogeneity across regions, which of course calls for a much richer approach, just trying to measure development at a much more granular kind of level. A second way to motivate our discussion, which, as I mentioned in my introduction, will continue in the lectures to come, is that typically policies, and you have been inquiring about many of those policies, for example, agriculture policies implemented at the newly independent African states in the 60s or the 70s, trade openness policies that are way more recent, investments in roads and railroads, not to say foreign aid and foreign direct investment, tend to have heterogeneous effects across regions, and therefore we need richer and more granular data to try to say something much more meaningful about their impact. As you will see in the weeks to come, we will study various historical episodes, for example, the impact of the infamous African slave trades or various aspects of colonization that tended to have differential effects in the boundaries of the same contemporary country across region, perhaps across some other grouping that we will do. So let me now pass the floor to Tanner and continue the discussion. And Tanner will try to give an overview of what kind of data exists out there. He will mostly focus on databases that have a so-called Pan-African viewpoint, so we can get them from countries from the West, from Eastern Africa, from Southern Africa, and from the northern part of Africa. And those data could be very useful both for so-called macro designs, cross-country comparisons, but mostly for so-called meso designs or even micro designs where we can exploit the regional variation or individual level variation. So Tanner, let me now pass the floor to you and thanks for once more for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Elias. That was a great introduction to measuring spatial development. And so just as Elias just mentioned, I'm going for the rest of this lecture to go through a high-level overview of some of the most commonly used data sources in the study of African development and economic history. Now, as Elias mentioned, these data sets are all Pan-African in that they are available across multiple countries in Africa, though as we'll see, some are more widely available than others. Because of this, these data sets lend themselves to this meso-level analysis that Elias just mentioned. And of course, they have been applied for both micro and macro analyses, but the fact that they're available across countries and disaggregated within countries makes them especially important for this meso-level analysis. Now, we're going to go over a few different types of data. First, we'll look at geospatial data with a focus on luminosity, or what are called nighttime lights. Second, we'll go do an overview of some of the Pan-African surveys that are used in the literature. Third, we'll look at administrative data focusing on censuses. And finally, we'll look at an assortment of other data, including conflict and satellite imagery. Now, each of these data sets are only going to be covered briefly, but what we've done is provide links to the data sources, as well as examples from the literature that have made use of each type of these data. And so we encourage those of you that are interested to return to these slides and go and explore those papers and data sources more closely on your own time. And then finally, just before getting started, I want to think back to Morton's special lecture in week 1. And as we go through these slides, I want you to consider how these data shape the economic questions that we ask. And so each of these data sets at some point in the literature opened up the possibility of asking new questions. But right now, there's still many blind spots in the literature. So it's very important for you to think, what are these blind spots? And what are some, yet unused, maybe data sets I don't mention here, that you could help, you could gather to help our understanding for African economic development and history. So again, this goes back to this theme of the course that we want to get feedback from you. So please post in the Q&A, your thoughts on where this data is limiting and where we could try to make improvements. Okay, let me move on to the first data set. And this is one that has really revolutionized the meso-level analysis of African development. So Elias mentioned this briefly, but using images from satellites taken during the night, we can use the brightness of a region to proxy for its economic development. Okay? And we call this data kind of sometimes luminosity and sometimes nighttime lights. Okay? And the benefit of this data is that it's available across the globe at a very fine geographic level. So every 1 square kilometer across the globe has a nightlight value. This data is also repeated over time since 1992. Usually we'll see it used annually, but the data even exists at the daily level. There are kind of 2 patched together overlapping series here. An early series called the DMSP goes from 1992 to 2013. While VEERS, a later series, started in 2013 and continues today. These data here come from the NOA and from NASA, and they can be downloaded from this Earth Observation Group. Okay, and I'm just going to point this out here that once you get the slides after lecture, you can go to these download links and investigate this data yourself. Okay, but there's also important caveats to the nightlights data, and all data have their downsides. So one is that the brightness of a pixel, what we've said is it can be thought of a proxy for development, but development can mean lots of different things, right? We can think that nightlights are proxying for population, for income, for electrification, and so on. And so this data on its own cannot distinguish those things separately. And there's also technical issues with the nightlights data. And common ones, there's kind of 2 quite common ones. The first is called blooming. And blooming is this issue that light recorded in a particular area is a combination of light that's emitted in that area, but also light that's emitted from neighboring areas. So the light tends to spill over and smudge across areas. Another common issue is called top coating, which is a result of the limited capacity of these satellites to capture wide ranges of values. And the result is that very bright lights do not get measured. So the newer VIIRS dataset doesn't really suffer from these issues in the same way that the DMSP does. And there's also papers in the literature that attempt to fix this DMSP data and correct for those issues. So there are kind of ways around some of these technical issues. Yeah, and then one final point with nightlights, which is important in the African context, is that a lot of the development in Africa simply does not emit light that's strong enough to be picked up by satellites, right? So the type of light that's being picked up here is like street lamps, quite high levels of light. If you have a single light bulb or even a few light bulbs in your home, on its own, that probably won't be picked up by these satellites. So what is the point here? Well, even in dark areas, there can be a lot of variation in the development on the ground, and our satellite images at night aren't going to be able to tell us about that development. Okay, but let's take a look at these data sets themselves. So this figure here, through this, we can watch the series of luminosity data from 1992 to 2020. And what these lights show, among many things, is just the general trend of economic growth in Africa. And aside from just that general trend, thinking back to Elias's national GDP statistics, what we can really see is within countries at a very fine level, where is the development and how is that development growing locally? Let's look instead at a comparison where we have Africa and compared with North America. And here we can just simply show that the nightlights highlight the very different levels of development across these two regions. We can look at a African case study, which is hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. And here we can see the progression of lights from 2005 to 2008, the period of hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. We can see the lights shrinking until 2008 when hyperinflation hit its peak. And then following the end of this hyperinflation, we see a rebound in development as measured in these lights. Another example is the growth of South Africa. So following the end of apartheid, South Africa grew both in population and GDP quite rapidly. But what we can see from the lights is not only this overall growth, but also that the growth, there was a lot of growth in the hinterland. And so from the nightlights, we can see that there's been a reduction in spatial inequality across the country in terms of development proxied by lights. Okay, now one application of these nightlights in the literature is this recent paper, which studies the impact of landmine removal on local development, again, proxied by lights, in Mozambique. Right? So on the left, here we have districts in Mozambique that are darker, where they have more landmines. And the paper shows that landmine clearance leads to an increase in local development as proxied by these lights on the right-hand side. Okay. Now, there's plenty of other examples of luminosity data used in the literature, and we've listed a few here. So again, you can explore them as you like later on. But let me just point out this first paper, which is by Stelios and Elias, which shows that pre-colonial political concentration determines local development today. And this is what we heard Stelios talking about earlier this week. Hey, but again, I encourage you to go and read many of these other papers applying nightlights in their studies. Okay, this next set of literature is not about applying luminosity data to study development, but rather on their validation as a proxy for development, asking the question, are nightlights a sensible proxy of development? So if you're interested in thinking about using nightlights, you should go and read these papers to get a better idea of how we think they measure economic development. And let me move on to another data set. This one measures the amount of built cover. So when we're talking about built cover, you should think of buildings, concrete, and asphalt. And this data is also based on images taken from satellites, just like the nightlights are. But these images were taken during the day. Okay? And the data is processed images by remote sensing experts, not economists, to produce this data set of built cover. Now, there's many different attempts to try to do this. And this one in particular is called the Global Human Settlements Layer, or the GHSL. And what it does specifically is it records the share of space that is built up all across the world for 4 points in time, from 1975, 1990, 2000, and 2014. And what we can see here in this figure is just the massive growth of Lagos in Nigeria since 1975. The high resolution of this data means that we can track not only the amount and intensity of this development, but its form and shape as well. So in particular, this one paper here that I've listed uses this data to show that cities established under British colonizers have more fragmented development than their French counterparts do today. And French colonial cities tended to be planned on a grid, unlike British ones. And so this is kind of the rationale for why today we see more compact French cities, ex-French cities. Now, this data is made available by the European Commission. And again, I've provided the link for you to explore on your own. Another important GIS data set that's been used in the literature is on elevation. So this data set plotted here is called the SRTM. And again, it's based on data from satellites. It records the height above sea level all across the world. And so we might be interested in this because it's economically important for many things, including agriculture, whether a region floods, conflict, many other things. But one very interesting application of this data is in this paper by Nathan and his co-author. And in that paper, they use elevation data to calculate a measure of ruggedness, or what we can think of as how hilly a region is. And in their paper, they show that rugged areas were relatively protected from slave raids compared to flatter regions. Okay. And so, we're going to hear more about the slave trade from Nathan later on in the course. And so this data, if you're interested, is provided by the US Geological Survey. One more geospatial data set is this measure of agricultural suitability. And this data set that I've plotted here, is available all across the world. And each cell represents the share of land that can grow crops. So the dark green areas are areas where more land is available for agriculture. Now, Stelios has used this data to show that geographic variability is a fundamental determinant of ethno-linguistic diversity. But there's also many other sources on agriculture. This one here is provided by the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Okay, so that wraps up the kind of quick overview of geospatial data. Next, I want to talk about surveys. And we're going to start with the Demographic and Health Survey. Okay, so these surveys are quite useful and often used in the literature. They ask many questions covering topics from fertility to education, about a household's assets and wealth, also about health, many different questions. And so as we can see from this figure, These surveys are widely available across Africa. Almost every country has at least one DHS survey. And the surveys also go back in time. Okay, they start as early as 1985. And in each in each survey, it's going to be based on a sample of the population. Okay. So again, there's some limitations to these data, even though they can be incredibly useful. And the main limitations with the DHS are due, primarily to their sampling. So because of the way that each period, a different random sample is created, that means that despite there being repeated data over time, the specific people and localities that are randomly sampled do not necessarily overlap. Okay, so that's one downside. Another is that these samples can actually differ over the years. So in some years, they'll sample, all households. And then in some years, they'll sample, from the female population only. So that means, across years, it's not always consistent. And then one final point here is just that the sampling tends to be biased towards capital cities and large urban areas. So, the data is even a bit more thin in rural areas. Okay, but let's take a look at the data. So in this first slide, this is just plotting the coverage of DHS surveys from 2010 to 2020. And we can see here, that there's quite, broad coverage of these surveys. We can use them to plot things like the average wealth in a location, or the share of the population that has finished primary school in a location, or the share of households with piped water. There's many other questions, and these are just some of the big ones that we can look at with DHS. Now let's zoom in and just take a closer look at that. Here we're looking at Nigeria, okay? And this is the DHS coverage for two surveys. One in 2003, each survey cluster their point is marked by a red circle. And then in each survey cluster in 2018 is marked by a blue X, okay? And what we can see already is just that there's a big spread in both data in 2003 and data in 2018, but the two often don't perfectly overlap. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, let's say we want to plot wealth across the country. In 2003, it will look like this figure on the left, and in 2018, it will look like this figure on the right. Now, in both figures, we can kind of see this pattern that there's more wealth near the coast in Nigeria than there is in the hinterland. But what is also really apparent here is that there's many kind of holes in the data. And so if we want to look at, let's say, changes over time in a local area, it can be difficult to do because we don't necessarily have overlapping data across years. Okay, we can do the same sort of exercise for the DRC, but I'll skip through that just in the interest of time. And instead, we can turn to the applications of this DHS data in the literature. And so again, we've listed many here that you should go and look at if you're interested. But I want to highlight this first paper that shows that historical exposure to colonial concessions cause significantly worse education, wealth, and health outcomes in the long run. And so we're going to hear more about this paper and about concessions in general during week 8 from the author of this paper, Sarah Lowes. So you should stay tuned for that. It's quite interesting. And yes, again, we should look at these other papers, if we're interested in learning more about how the DHS gets applied in the literature. Another big survey is this Afrobarometer survey. And here, what respondents are asked are questions about their opinions and preferences and beliefs. Okay, so we can see from the map here that the coverage is also broad, maybe not quite as broad as DHS, but covers many African, well, 37 African countries. And these are also surveys that are based on a sample of the population. And again, that sample is kind of much smaller than the DHS. There are 6 rounds of this data from 1999 to 2015. So they're also, repeat over time. So we can look at, how some of these opinions vary over time. Okay, but some of the caveats, again, are very similar to the DHS because the samples are small. The data are only representative at the country level in this case. And also, like the DHS, the coverage of these data within countries can be sparse, even more so than the DHS. And, for similar reasons, the respondents and locations in these surveys are not necessarily repeated over time. Okay, so if we want to know, again, how opinions or beliefs change at a local level over time, that's more difficult to do with this data. Okay, so let's take a look at, what is an example of one of these questions? I know, beliefs, opinions is quite a vague term. So what we can plot here is an example of one of those questions, which is respondents are asked, how would they describe the present economic condition of this country? Okay, and so in this map, countries that are in orange, have a worse view of the economic condition of their country, and countries that are colored blue have a better opinion about how their country is doing economically. We can zoom in and look at the same question in both Nigeria and Tanzania. And so what I found kind of interesting here is in Nigeria on the left-hand side, those living near the coast tend to have lower opinions of the country's economic conditions than those further inland, right? So the orange near the coast suggests that the opinion about the economic condition of the country is lower than that of respondents in the hinterland. I found this kind of interesting, seeing that we just saw from the DHS that, wealth is actually much higher, much more concentrated along the coast in Nigeria. Okay, nothing, too much to think into this, but it's something, nice that we can think about, how are these, opinions and beliefs formed in these countries. Okay. One other application, there's many questions in the Afrobarometer, but one other, let's point out, is it asks which institutions are trusted and which are thought of as corrupt. Now, we've seen a lot of this from Stelios already this week, but what we plot here is just showing that both trust and perceived corruption are favorable for traditional leaders. So what does that mean? It means that traditional leaders have relatively high amounts of trust relative to these other institutions like national parliaments, national courts, and the local assembly. And on the right-hand side, traditional leaders are also seen as less corrupt than those other institutions. Okay, now for paper applications, I want to point out this one excellent paper by Nathan and Leonard that's first in this list. And in this paper, they show that exposure to the slave trade creates lower levels of trust today. And so again, stay tuned because we're going to hear a lot more about the slave trades from Nathan himself in week 4. Okay, so that kind of wraps up these surveys, both the DHS and the Afrobarometer. In this next section, I want to talk about administrative data. So these are basically, other types of surveys, but rather than coming from international organizations, these data are collected by African government administrations, national administrations. Okay, so the first data set here are country censuses. And these are surveys that are conducted at the country level for the entire population. So they don't have those kind of whole that patchiness issue that we saw with the DHS. Okay, it is true that only some of the questions are used, or so only some of the questions asked are only done for a sample. Okay, so some of the more kind of longer questions are only asked for a sample of the population, but many questions are asked for the entire population. Some of the typical questions relate to education, employment, and housing, but many other dimensions are asked in the census. Typically, these censuses repeat every 10 years, but we should also note that more recently, these censuses have become more widely available across countries and also of better kind of quality, higher resolution. I have the source here, but unlike the other data sets, we can't access these online. They're not hosted publicly. You need to approach statistical agencies individually if you want to get access to these census data. Some other caveats, these data are limited, relative to the DHS. They're relatively spatially coarse. So the DHS, pinpoints the location of an individual, whereas in the census, we have a broader, region where we know that they live. The other thing is, they're not as frequent. Typically they occur every 10 years. And so if you're thinking about analyzing anything, at a higher frequency, it's going to be difficult using the censuses. And the other kind of big hurdle here is that they're not standardized across countries. And as I mentioned, they can be quite difficult to access because they're not publicly available online. But let's take a look at an example. Here, we use the census from Mozambique to plot at the district level, what is the average years of schooling for an adult, both on the left-hand side in 1997 and then on the right-hand side in 2007. Again, we can see that near Maputo, education levels are quite high, and over time, that region is getting more educated. So again, here's a list of some of the papers that use census data, apply census data to their research question. One interesting one is this one up top, which uses country census data from Cameroon to show, among many things, that men born on the British side of partition, so Cameroon was partitioned at one point with a British side and a French side. They show that the British side has more educated men than the French side. And we're going to hear a lot more about colonization and human capital from Elias and Leonard in week 6. Okay, but so, as I was saying, a main problem with those country censuses is that they're not publicly available and they're not standardized across countries. So luckily for that problem, we have a solution, which is IPUMS. Okay, so IPUMS, or it stands for Integrated Public Use Microdata Series. And what this data set does is it integrates censuses over many countries and years and stores it all in a centralized database that you can publicly access yourself. So because of this, we can measure similar characteristics as the country censuses do, but it's much more accessible and standardized than those country censuses are. Okay, the downside of IPUMS relative to those country censuses is that they are a sample of the full census, typically 10%. Okay, and maybe even more importantly, some details that are only available in the source censuses. So, for instance, in the census, the location of the household will be highly accurate, highly local, while the DHS anonymizes this to some extent by only providing, larger geographies in the data. And another caveat is that not everything is standardized. And again, going back to the geography, the geographic boundaries that correspond to the data in IPUMS are not always easy to match. Okay, so in some countries, and especially going back in time, it can be difficult to match the locations that are in the census records with actual boundaries on the Earth. Okay, and so one kind of ingenious application of this IPOMS data, which really leveraged the uniqueness of this data, was this study on intergenerational mobility in Africa. And so because of the fact that IPOMS has relationships between household members in a household, for many households in many countries across Africa, the authors are able to measure mobility, okay? And they do this in terms of mobility is defined as the chance that a child born to uneducated parents becomes educated. And they also define downwards mobility as the chance that a child born to educated parents does not become educated. Okay? And because of the uniqueness of the IPOMS data that has this household structured, they're able to do this, relate children to their parents for many households. This paper shows that there is an effect of place on intergenerational mobility. What does that mean? Children of uneducated parents are more likely to become educated if mobility in the region where they grow up is high. Okay, so that means that, depending on where you grow up, you might have a better or worse chance of succeeding in terms of educational outcomes. Okay, that paper is listed here at the top, and there's again other papers that you should go look at if you're interested in seeing how IPOMS is applied in the literature. Okay. One final piece of administrative data are the boundaries of administrative areas. Now, these were implicitly used in those slides that I just showed you on country censuses and IPOMS, but they're worth discussing on their own. So there's many different versions of administrative boundaries, right? So IPOMS provides some, the country censuses, the country statistics bureaus, they'll provide some. But this set here that I've plotted is from a source called GATM. And it's a useful source because it's fairly comprehensive. It covers administrative boundaries over the entire world. Okay, one downside is that it only does this for one point in time. And so, especially if you have even just data that's 10 years old, it might not match to these boundaries. And the other thing is that there can be variability in the quality of the GATM data across countries. So some countries, have administrative boundaries at a very local level, while other countries are not provided except for at a kind of higher regional level. Okay, and so that takes me to the last set of data, which is our other miscellaneous data sources. So the first one that I want to cover here is data on conflict. And here we just present two of the main data sets used to study conflict. The first is this UCDP GED, which records major and minor civil wars and civilian violence from 1989 to 2019. So again, a time series. And a big attraction of that data set is that it employs a standard definition of conflict that is easily comparable in the literature on conflict. The second data set is called ACLED, and it uses a slightly less standard definition, and it's based on the aggregation of news sources. And so it covers many different types of conflict from 1997 till 2022. Okay. Let's take a look at this data. So here, we're using ACLED as an example. And I've plotted 4 types of conflict events. Battles are in yellow, violence against civilian in blue, riots in orange, and the gray dots represent events that had some combination of these types of conflict. Okay, but let's take a zoom in, and here we can look at Ethiopia. We're going to look at 2 periods under the current Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed. His first 2 years as prime minister were relatively peaceful from 2018 to 2019. And this is reflected in the ACLED data, with no large conflict events in Ethiopia over that period of time. But we can see, from 2020 to 2021, that conflict in the Tigray region appears in this ACLED data. Okay, turning to applications. Again, I'll just point out one of these papers. The first, by Stelios and Elias, studies the effects of the scramble for Africa on conflict. And what they find is that the incidence, severity, and duration of political violence are all higher for partitioned homelands. So homelands that got, cut in half by national boundaries that were drawn. And so we're going to hear a lot more about this and the scramble for Africa from Stelios in week 5. Okay, so just a couple more, other data sources. The first, is this recent development in the literature, which has been to use even higher resolution satellite images than we saw with the nightlights and built cover. And these VHR, or very high resolution images, are what you would see in Google Earth. And they take a measurement on the Earth at least every 50 centimeters. And so this high resolution has both upsides and downsides, right? So it means that local development can be measured in a very consistent way all across the world and over time. But because this data is so, high resolution, they're very expensive and difficult to work with computationally. Okay, but they're starting to be employed in the economics literature more frequently. In this one paper example, it's a paper of mine, we use this VHR derived data to show how buildings in Nairobi are built and redeveloped over time. So using a model, an economic model, we can show that due to the historical legacy of land rights, frictions preventing the conversion of land from informal to formal use can result in losses that are equal to about 30 years of a typical household's rent. Okay, so we're showing that, using this data, there's a huge, hurdle to overcome in terms of, building high density buildings in some of these areas under informal property rights. A kind of a related source of data uses also, high resolution imagery. And this has been another, recent development in the literature. And here the idea is to combine that survey data we saw with satellite images. Okay, here they're going to use both night lights and images taken during the day. And they're going to use machine learning to train a model to predict the level of wealth in, all areas based on features in the images. Okay, so why are we bothering doing this? Well, it fills out those gaps that we saw in the survey data, like for the DHS, right? So because these images are available all across the world and repeated over time, we can extrapolate the survey data to areas that weren't surveyed. So this figure here in the slide shows predicted wealth across Nigeria. And you'll recall, when we just look at the DHS, we can't see, we can't get a measure of wealth for all locations. We only get kind of this spotty coverage. So this data is quite nice. It fills in all those holes and it allows us to look at changes over time. Okay, the caveats here are that this data, the predicted data, are proprietary and they require purchasing a license, right, which can be quite expensive. And while, this paper, and there are other papers that do similar things, they do explain, their methodology, but this methodology isn't straightforward for most researchers, in the social sciences to implement themselves. It requires a lot of computing power. Okay, so I know that was a brief overview of many different data sources. So I just want to summarize that what we've seen today has just been a high-level overview. We went over some of the most commonly used data sources in the study of African development and economic history. And as I said, each of these data sets was only covered briefly. So if you're interested in one of those in particular, again, please go read those papers that we've shared in the slides and use the links that have been provided for each of them. Okay, and then again, there are many data sets that we did not cover here that are used in the literature, but also many that have still been unused that we don't know about. So I want to just leave everyone thinking, what kind of data was missing from this lecture? And how does the available data that we've presented, how does that shape the questions that get asked and answered on African development? And so, importantly, it's good for you to think about, novel data sources that could help answer the questions that you think are left unanswered by the data that we use currently. So thank you very much. I think I'll now pass on the floor.
Thank you so much, Elias and Tanner, for this great presentation. It's really great to learn about these various data sources that are great input into analyzing economic questions. So for those of you who have been coming, as you know, we will try to tackle as many questions as possible in this session. And for the questions that will not be addressed here, the team will make sure they review it and provide answers that will be posted online. So we start the questions that were asked. Thank you again for the great engagement. So I will address this question, I think, to both of you. There have been many questions related to data, especially data quality, and how this really shapes even the results that come out of the economic research. For example, people mention how accurate the data are. What about the process that come in terms of reliability, and how independent even the institutions that are involved affects the quality of the data. So I will leave it to you, Tanner or Elias. You can go on this question.
I can take that question. Right, and I mean, that's a terrific question. I mean, and that's kind of what I was trying. I mean, we're trying to do with these slides is not only point out, what are kind of the uses of the data, and the kind of strong points of the data that we currently use, but also to point out, their limitations. And so, at least from, the state of data across studies right now, I think it's important that, there's a variety of data sources, right? So we saw, nightlights, we saw DHS, we saw censuses, and because we have this variety, limitations in some are made up by strengths in others, right? So the nightlights data we thought was is good data because it measures every location repeated over time, so it's really good to look at changes. But we said the nightlights data doesn't tell us much more than vaguely there's some development going on. Right, so we can turn to the DHS data and say, there's some development. Let's see, is this about improvements in education? Is it about improvements in infrastructure, improvements in health? We can get a much more nuanced picture using that other data source. So I think at least for the current state of affairs, it's important, and I think increasingly papers are doing this, is that they won't only use one of these data sets; they'll use some combination to try to strengthen one another.
Great, thank you. And closely related to this question about data quality, some people mention that to what extent this data quality can actually relate to the development itself. So can data quality inform how developed is a country? And moreover, what can we do about this? I think you have already pointed some efforts that have been made to make better data sets, but do you want to specifically speak again about either current efforts or other efforts that need to be made institutionally at the local level to improve the data quality?
So let me try, Marina. Thanks again for coordinating so many questions. I have two parts for this spot-on question. First, we can combine data sets. Let me stress what Tanner mentioned. They can both be measured with noise, with error, but as long as the two errors are unrelated to each other or weakly related to each other, we can do considerable progress. So for example, satellite imagery, and Tanner gave the example of light density at night, but we also have data, for example, on the quality of roofs from daytime or land use. Those data have problems, but quote unquote, do not have quote unquote human error. Mm-hmm. Other statistics like surveys, like GDP, do have human error, and many of our friends in the audience say, oh, perhaps this is even systematic. Some people are doing a better job than other job. So we can combine the two and we can progress at least to some extent. My second remark, which relates specific to your question, is that clearly in a place that is marked with conflict and civil war, it's very hard to collect data. There, I think, however, we have kind of some rough ways out. One, again, is satellite approaches. Mm-hmm. Second, we have this data set that Tanner mentioned by ACLED or UCDP GED. So these are done by research institutes that specialize in the study of conflict. And they have dedicated teams, in some instances, of local scholars. Quite often they rely on local news to get some information. Again, nothing is perfect by itself, but I think a general message that Leonard, Stelios, Nathan, and I and our guests are trying to convey is that we can still use data, acknowledging some mistakes, and the research effort goes on. It doesn't end. So one could always come up with better data, improve, and this is part, if you like, of economics research.
Thank you so much. We will now turn into, as Tanner was concluding, there are possibly many other data sources. So in the chat, there were specific questions on where one can find other data sources. So one question is coming from Patrick Manning, who is asking whether you would have any suggestion on data that would include figures on international migration among African states and remittances, whether there's any work on remittances in Africa. So I think we can do this in two steps. There's this one question on migration and remittances. There's also questions about data coming from sources like social media, like Facebook, and other data that would provide further spatial variation at the sectoral and local level. Will Tanner go first?
Yeah, I could go first there. So I think there's one kind of neat new use of data out there, which is the use of mobile phone data, which I think can speak to Patrick's question about migration and remittances. So there's at least one paper that I've seen. I'm looking at Rwanda that uses cell phone data to see how, following a natural disaster, how remittances are sent to, families in locations that were hit by a natural disaster. So I think this is, another cool, new data set, that again, kind of doesn't rely on, doesn't have that kind of human error that Elias mentioned about surveys, right? That can, as long as you have, the buy-in from the telecoms company, you can get access to this data that's just, recorded as people communicate over their phones. So it doesn't, rely on a lot of surveying and whatnot. And I think there's also, some growing use of the censuses. I know Sebastian Homan has work using the censuses to study migration, because the censuses have birthplaces of individuals and where they currently reside. And so there's some recent effort using those censuses themselves or the IPUMs to study migration within Africa. I can also say that this social media question, I actually have a paper of my own. It's not based in Africa, it's based in North America, but it uses Facebook connections. And these data are available in Africa at the regional level. So it will tell you, for every pair of regions, not only within Africa, but all across the world, how many friendships there are across that pair. Now, that, can be quite interesting to work with, but you need to start thinking about, what are the biases in that kind of data? If there's areas where many people don't have internet access and they're not well connected, if they're not connected on Facebook, then, it's not clear what that data is going to be proxying. It might just be proxying connections for a very kind of small segment of the population. But, the encouraging thing is there's lots of new data coming out, right? Because the world is becoming more digitalized, data like Facebook and cell phone data is becoming more available. So I would say, you can go check out Facebook, but otherwise, I think you've got to keep your eyes peeled and think about what kind of data like that can be useful for whatever you want to study.
Awesome, thank you. Maybe Elias, you want to talk about this other source that was inquired about on sustainable development. Are there data sources out there one can rely on to study questions related to climate change and others?
A great question, Marina, and thanks for the friends who are posing this question. Let me just also add to Tanner that almost surely there are many country-specific sources, for example, surveys that at least I believe also Tanner are not aware of. So one of the beauty of research is that, people can have access to some interesting data that could be of particular usefulness to some interesting research question. Now, regarding the sustainable goals, first of all, we have the data that I think Tanner mentioned on land use have been used by researchers to study deforestation, which is clearly one aspect of climate change. So clearly the data can be used to study, deforestation, which is a big issue across the continent. A second kind of data, for example, one of the teaching fellows of this course that many of our friends will meet next Friday when we will start the review sessions, Guy Pincus, is working, for example, on the illegal trade of wildlife. And he, if asked, can give you information how one could get data about the illegal hunting of elephants, of rhinos, which is another actually quite important issue for many African countries because they lose potential tourist revenues out of that. Third, there is also satellite approaches that measure CO2 emissions, and they use the quality of the air, to put it in lack of a better word, to get some hunch of that. I have also seen some data from oceans on pollution that could reflect, for example, the pollution of rivers, which, for example, I know have many friends from Nigeria. I think it's a big issue there, also in Mozambique and many other parts of the continent. So let me just reiterate, Marina, what you said and what Tanner mentioned. We live in the epoch of big data. Big data have been transforming the way business is being conducted, the way policy is being conducted in the US, in Europe, in the United Kingdom. So there's nothing, quote unquote, strictly speaking about Africa, but these data do exist. But, perhaps sometimes you need to manipulate them a bit and work on them, but this is clearly one way forward. We also say, I think, a related question that I didn't have time to respond to. Are these data used for policy? They should, is the answer that I'm offering.
Thank you so much. This is really great. I would like to come back to some specific questions that were asked on specific data sets. For example, the light data. There were many questions that, again, it's back to the quality and how this correlates with some geographic aspects. So people say, for example, in rural Nigeria, there's still economic activity, but no electricity. And how, finally, do you think about the nightlight data? Someone else asks, this is Emmanuel, asked that luminosity is referred here is somewhat post-colonial issues. So he's wondering about the African economic development. Is that against the influence of technology is the way things have been moving recently? So would you mind saying a little more about the nightlight data specifically, Tainer?
Yeah, of course. So I would say, first of all, yeah, I would acknowledge both of those comments as being quite valid, right? And so this is something that I tried to point out, but this example of rural Nigeria is a good one, right? So sure, it's dark, we can't see anything there. That doesn't mean that there isn't economic activity going on there, and it doesn't mean that in some of those dark areas there's more economic activity than other dark areas. We can't tell with that data set. And so it's actually, I think it's something that's in general coming out on this literature on the validation of these nightlights. It tends to be that, the nightlights are better for looking at development across like urban areas, right? Now, it's not to say it's useless everywhere else, but, just as, we'd expect, it's better in these areas where, we'd expect there to be at least some light. Right, and so yeah, again, every data set has its limitations, and so we need to be aware of those, and we need to be able to try to think of complementing that data with something else if we want to, for instance, study rural development. And then to the question about whether the nightlights, are giving an unfair, I guess, view of development or a biased view of development in Africa. Again, I'd say, we need to be careful in over-interpreting these data, right? Just because it's dark doesn't mean we're saying that there's no development or there's underdevelopment. But, an interesting thing, and, Elias has mentioned this already as well, is that, before these nightlights data, we were looking at these GDP statistics. And until we brought in the nightlights data, the nightlights were actually able to, help us show like where the GDP statistics can be going wrong. So I think, rather than thinking of like, this is, the nightlights can't tell us everything, they are valuable, and they improve the way that we understood development from before. So, again, before we had, limitations, we still have limitations today, but we're making some progress, I think.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we might have time for one last question. It's hard to choose, but I think Elias has already started talking about data for policy, and there's been a question, it's a little bit philosophical, about can we actually measure anything? Can we actually study people? Because like human is a research subject. Do you have anything to say about broadly about studying human in a way that relates to the talk today, and also just how this is really might be important for informing policy in general? Thank you.
Since I have studied a bit of philosophy in my law degree, let me take a first stab on this spot-on question. So before I go to philosophy, the economist inside me tells me that we have to measure things. Perhaps not perfectly, but this is an endeavor that we should continue. Let me stress that 30 years ago, we had imprecise GDP data. Then we had better data on GDP. This effort continues. Now we are going much more granular, thinking about inequality. It's a step forward, a considerable step forward. And big data is revolutionizing the way we think about development. And now let me come to your question, Marina, also human behavior. For example, I have seen statistics, mostly in the UK, how much time, individuals spend on Facebook or on social media, what kind of sources they get. If someone was to tell my father, who I think is 75, that he would be able to say what people are interested in, how much time they spend, this is truly revolutionary, and it goes to human behavior. Thirdly, on human behavior, let me say that in the future weeks, we will see very innovative research, among others by Nathan Nunn, by Sarah Lowe's, that they're trying to do lab in the field experiments, so try to have some good idea about how people think. And have something to say about their behavior. Our speaker next week, Ama, is doing super interesting work on how people feel, how they engage in risk sharing. Again, clearly one can object and perhaps should object. This is how academia progresses, but these are considerable way forwards as compared to what we thought 30 or 40 years ago. And let me conclude saying that a lot of the stereotypes that many Westerners who had not spent time in Africa were having was because of the lack of this data. So now actually this data can be extremely useful, not only to understand Africa, but other parts of the world in a much better way, and hopefully have policies that take into account this information about the societal fabric, for example, and design interventions. And I think this is what Nathan Nunn will start discussing. Actually, it's a good question for what we will see next week with Nathan, Ava, and Ama, who will discuss not cultural issues. One would have said, how on earth can we measure culture if I was to go back in my philosophy course, but actually there have been some ways to measure that, not perfect, but a step further.
Thank you so much. I think with that, I will yield the floor to you. Thank you. And as we said, for the questions that were not addressed here, please expect to see them posted online next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina, and thank you very much, Tanner, and thank you all for staying. Let me say that it is stunning that we have 2,000 people in such a dense topic such as data. And thank you all for the, roughly speaking, 150 questions that we took. Please continue emailing us with suggestions, with comments. We appreciate the thank you. We also appreciate the more critical remarks. We are trying to do amendments and accommodate various needs. For Nathan, Leonard, Stelios needs, this is also a new initiative, so we're trying to improve as things happen. Next week, we will start discussing how we will try to do a first step on social structure, discuss issues related to kinship, to family, to social relations, to cultural economics more generally, which has been a very vibrant field of economics in the past 15 to 20 years. So again, what you will mostly discuss with Nathan Nunn and his guests, you will see something zooming in Africa, but of much wider importance in economics. Besides, let me flag that on Thursday, February 17th, we have added a special lecture. We were debating ourselves about the title, so we settled on African history through the remarkable life of Leonard Wantchekon, our dear friend and co-instructor here. So this was not in the initial program, so let me just flag that. You will receive later on today the typical weekly email with what we have covered this week and what is the week to come. By Monday, we will upload questions, the most frequently asked questions. Our team will be working, drafting some answers. The lecture slides and video recordings will be posted on the course website. You can already find the lecture slides even for today's lecture. Our team that is working endlessly, and we're deeply appreciating their help, will put the lecture slides, roughly speaking, after 1 week. Finally, let me flag that we have released a questionnaire. We really want to hear from you. We understand that perhaps we added too many questions, but we added too many questions because we're really thrilled with your wide support and participation. We kindly ask you to take this time and let us know more about your feelings, how you think about this course. In an effort to have an even better communication, given the large audience, starting next week on Fridays, we will have recitations, review sessions, where our amazing teaching fellow team of Alex, Guy, Ibrahim, Julian, and Alfred will try to take more questions and engage, hopefully, in a discussion with many of you. Thank you all. Enjoy your weekend and keep sending us questions. Thank you all very much.